Nora Elise Caldwell was 23 when the nursery gates closed behind her and left her with one duffel bag, $128, and no room she could safely return to. By evening, cold rain had darkened the empty plant racks where she used to sort dormant seed trays for winter storage. A probate notice, folded twice in her jacket pocket, said June Avery had left her an abandoned greenhouse outside Silver Creek, Oregon. The place came with cracked glazing frozen irrigation valves and an attached cottage no one had lived in for years. If Nora could not prove the will was sound, even that last shelter could be taken. But inside the glass house, one old propagation bench had remained fixed in place for decades. Beneath it, the frost would not hold. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain had started before noon, fine and needling, the kind that turned gravel black and made every cardboard box sag at the corners. Nora stood beside the locked nursery office with her duffel open on the ground and tried to decide what counted as hers. The owner had already taken the register, the ceramic pots, the hose reels, and the framed business license from the wall. What remained were things too worn to sell a pair of cotton gloves with soil ground into the seams, a cracked hand lens, 3 paper packets of expired lettuce seed, and the brass key to the potting shed that no longer opened anything. She took the gloves and left the key. Her faded olive work jacket was damp across the shoulders. Under it, the gray hoodie June Avery had given her years ago had lost its shape, but the cuffs still held the faint smell of cedar shavings and greenhouse soil when the rain warmed them against her wrists. Nora tied her dark blonde hair lower at the back of her neck, zipped the duffel, and looked once through the chain-link fence. Only, that morning the nursery had still seemed like a poor kind of footing. It paid just enough for bus fare detergent and a shared room in a house where the locks changed more often than the rules. By lunchtime, the owner had gathered the last 3 employees under the loading awning and said the words plainly. The lease was gone. The winter orders had not come. He was sorry. Nora had believed him. That was the worst of it. He was not cruel. He looked at the puddles while he spoke, and when he handed her final envelope across a stack of empty flats, he turned it so the bills would not blow away. "Wish I had another month for you," he said. She nodded because there was no answer that would buy heat. For almost 2 years, she had been the one who noticed which trays were drying at the edges, which roots had circled the plug too tightly, which labels were fading before the seedlings could be moved outside. She liked work that answered back slowly. A seed either swelled or it did not. A cutting either rooted or blackened at the stem. You could do everything right and still lose half a tray, but at least the loss was honest. June had taught her that. On foster home weekends when Nora was 16 and expected nothing good to last past Sunday evening June. Avery would let her stand at the long bench in the old greenhouse and press seeds into soil with the eraser end of a pencil. June never crowded her with questions. She only showed her how deep to plant, how to mist without washing the seed into a corner, how to write the date and variety before memory made a liar of you. Once when Nora had apologized for dropping a tray of parsley starts, June had crouched beside the mess and picked soil from the broken roots. Some roots wait in the dark without dying. Nora had carried that sentence longer than she had carried most addresses. Now the shared room was gone too. After the nursery closed, she had gone back to the house on Maple Street and found her plastic storage bin on the porch, the lid held down with a brick. The woman who rented her the couch would not open the door all the way. Her boyfriend stood behind her in the hallway, one hand on the knob, watching Nora as if she were a weather problem that had blown in with the rain. "You can't stay tonight," the woman said. "I'm sorry, it's complicated." Nora looked at the bin, then at the swollen porch boards under her boots. Her toothbrush was in a grocery sack on top. Someone had folded her work shirts badly, but not meanly. That small care made the refusal harder to answer. "I paid through Friday," Nora said. "I know." No one raised a voice. No one had to. By then, Nora understood the kind of danger that kept itself calm. She took the bin to the bus shelter 2 blocks away, sorted what would fit into the duffel, and left behind a cracked lamp. 2 paperbacks and a chipped bowl she had bought for 50 cents because it was blue. When the bus came, she rode without choosing a destination until the driver told her it was the end of the line. At the public library, she counted her money in a bathroom stall, 153.20s, 110.5 and quarters gathered in a paper towel. $128. She dried the bills under the hand dryer and put them back in the envelope from the nursery. That was when she found the probate notice. It had been shoved into the side pocket of her duffel behind an old seed catalog and a receipt for cough drops. The envelope was cream-colored, too formal for the rest of her life, and addressed to Nora Elise Caldwell, in a careful hand that belonged to an office, not a friend. She sat in the library's back corner beneath a humming heater and read it once without understanding. Then again, slower. June Avery had died in November. Nora had known, in the vague way people know what they are afraid to confirm. June had stopped answering the phone near the end of autumn. The last card Nora received from her had carried only 3 lines and a press leaf from a tomato plant called Oregon Spring. Nora had kept meaning to write back when work settled, when rent settled, when she could put something cheerful in the envelope. Nothing settled. The notice said June's handwritten will named Nora as beneficiary of the greenhouse property on the edge of Silver Creek with its attached gardener's cottage and remaining contents. It said the estate was small. It said there would be a preliminary hearing. It said interested parties had raised questions regarding testamentary capacity. Nora read that phrase 3 times. At the probate office the next morning, a clerk with silver hair and a narrow black cardigan looked over the notice and did not soften the facts. Her nameplate read Mrs. Larkin. She had a stamp pad at her right hand and a mug of tea at her left, and she placed one finger on the line that mattered. "The will is already being challenged," she said. Nora kept both hands around the strap of her duffel. "By who?" "A distant cousin. He has counsel. You do not, as far as this file shows." "I didn't know there was anything to challenge." Mrs. Larkin looked at her, then not unkindly. "Often there isn't. That doesn't stop a person from trying." She gave Nora a photocopy of the property description, a temporary access letter, and a warning about liability. The greenhouse had not been inspected in years. The cottage might not be habitable. The county had received complaints about broken glass near the road. If Nora entered, she entered carefully. If she removed anything, she should document it. If the will failed, everything could be disputed. Nora folded the papers along their existing creases. Why would June leave it to me? The clerk's mouth shifted, almost a smile, almost not. That is a better question for the house than for this office. By late afternoon, Nora was on the last bus south with her duffel on her knees and the access letter tucked inside her jacket. The rain followed the road out of town. Fir trees gathered close to the shoulder. Beyond the glass, the hills rose dark and wet, and patches of old snow lay in the ditches like cloth left out too long. Silver Creek was smaller than she remembered, a closed feed store, a gas station with one pump working, a church sign with missing letters. The driver led her off near a county road where June's directions copied from the notice became less certain. Half a mile past the culvert left at the cedar posts, follow the gravel until the greenhouse roof shows through the trees. It was nearly dusk when Nora saw the first panes. The greenhouse stood beyond a sagging wire gate, long and pale against the darkening firs. Its iron wrist made a narrow cathedral shape under broken glass. Moss had climbed the roof in green-black patches, and several panes had slipped from their clips and rested inside the frame at dangerous angles. To the left, the gardener's cottage leaned into a stone chimney, its door swollen, its windows filmed with old weather. A cracked path ran between frozen beds, disappearing beneath blackberry canes. Nora did not go in. She stood at the gate until her fingers ached from the cold, reading the shape of the place the way she had once read trays of seedlings. Too much broken glass. Too little light. No clear floor. No phone signal strong enough to trust. She had survived this long by knowing when shelter was not yet shelter. So she slept sitting up in the bus shelter back in town, her duffel under her knees and June's access letter inside her jacket where no one could take it without waking her. Morning came hard and blue. Frost whitened the road shoulders when Nora walked back to the greenhouse. In full winter daylight, the damage looked less like a warning and more like a list. Broken panes on the west wall. A roof vent hanging crooked from rusted hardware. black irrigation lines stiff with ice along the baseboards, cedar benches gray with age. Soil spilled from overturned flats and frozen into little ridges. She lifted the gate latch with her sleeve and stepped through. The main greenhouse door resisted, then opened with a scrape that traveled through the iron frame. Cold air sat inside as firmly as water in a basin. Nothing moved except a thread of condensation loosening from a pane overhead and falling in a slow bead to the stone floor. Nora stayed near the entrance and let her eyes adjust. The place still held its order beneath the neglect. Main aisle down the center. Benches along both sides. Potting area near the cottage wall. Old labels wired to iron uprights. A fixed propagation bench stood halfway down the right side, heavier than the others, its cedar top darkened by years of mist and shade. That was where the frost stopped. Every stone around it was white except for one narrow line, clean and wet, running straight beneath the bench as if someone had drawn it with a warm finger. Nora crouched, not touching anything yet. A closed greenhouse in January should have been colder inside than out. With shattered glass above and frozen irrigation at the walls, there should have been no heat, no breath, no reason for the floor to remember warmth. She held her bare hand a few inches above the line. The air rising there was faint but real. Nora stayed very still, her duffel strap cutting into her shoulder, while frost melted in a straight line beneath the unmoved propagation bench. Nora pried open the swollen cottage door with both hands and felt the old wood give by inches, not all at once. The lower edge scraped over grit and a fan of broken glass that had blown in from a cracked window beside the sink. She stood on the threshold until the air inside settled around her boots, then found an old push broom leaning behind the door and swept a narrow path across the floor. The cottage smelled of dust, cedar, and cold ashes. Not rot, not yet. That mattered. Rot had a sweet, deep smell that meant water had gone where it pleased for too long. Here, the damage was sharper and more honest. A warped dormouse droppings under the counter, a broken pane patched once with cardboard and tape that had gone brittle. The little kitchen had a hand pump at the sink, a chipped enamel table, and two wooden chairs pulled close together as if someone had once sat there with another person and never moved them back. Nora set her duffel on the table, then moved it again when she saw the legs wobble. She worked the broom slowly, making piles instead of clouds. Glass first, then leaves, then gray dust from the corners. She had no trash bags, so she used a cracked plastic storage tub she found under the sink. Each piece of glass clicked against the last. By the time she had cleared the kitchen and the small front room, her fingers had gone stiff through the cotton gloves and a line of pale light had spread across the floorboards from the window over the sink. The cottage was not a home, not yet. But it had walls that stood a roof that did not show daylight and a door she could brace from the inside. Nora wrote that down on the back of a library receipt. Roof, no visible holes from cottage kitchen. Door, swollen latch weak. Window 1, broken cardboard, failed. Water unknown. Heat none. She made the list because lists did not ask what she felt. The greenhouse waited beyond the cottage wall, long and bright and ruined. In the full morning, the broken panes made small, dangerous mirrors in the beds along the main aisle. The iron ribs rose in regular arches over the stone floor. Their paint flaked away in brown strips where rust had opened beneath it. Old glazing clips clung to some bars and hung loose from others' thin metal teeth that had once held glass tight against winter wind. Moss had spread along the lower roof line, and in 3 places panes had slipped inward, resting on the frame at angles that could fall with a hard enough gust. Nora did not step beneath them until she had chosen her path. She found a roll of orange marking tape in the cottage pantry and tied short strips near the places where glass threatened overhead. Then she moved down the main aisle with her eyes lifted, pausing whenever the stone floor dipped or cracked under her boot. Along the side walls, black irrigation lines ran stiff with ice, some clipped to the baseboards, some fallen loose and bent like dead vines. A brass hose nozzle lay under one bench, split at the seam from freezing. June would have hated that Nora thought, then caught herself reaching for a memory as if it were a person. The potting area was at the cottage end of the greenhouse, exactly where Nora remembered it, and not as she remembered it at all. The long cedar work table was grayed and dry. The shelves above it held clay pots nested by size, a tin of plant labels, and a row of hand tools hung on cup hooks screwed into a board. Each hook had a label in June's small block letters: trowel, dibber, snips, soil knife, glazing points. Nora stood in front of them for a long moment. The labels were not sentimental. That was why they struck her. June had believed in naming a thing so the next hand could find it. Nora lifted the soil knife and found it oiled, though the handle had darkened with age. The trowel had a split near the ferrule, wrapped in copper wire. On a lower shelf, a metal box held wax pencils, twine, a hand lens, and a notebook with water stains along the bottom edge. Nora opened the notebook only far enough to see dates and seed names, then closed it again. There would be time to read once the place was safer. A truck came up the gravel drive just before noon. Nora heard it before she saw it, tires popping over frozen stones. For one quick second, her body prepared to hide the old habit arriving before thought. She set the soil knife down and walked to the cottage door with her shoulders level. A mail carrier in a blue jacket stood outside the gate with a clipboard and a certified envelope. Nora Caldwell. Yes, signature here. The envelope was from an attorney in Grants Pass. Nora knew what it was before she opened it because Mrs. Larkin had told her not to expect delay. The letter used more words than the clerk had, but it meant the same thing. June Avery's capacity was being questioned. The petitioner requested that no property or records be removed from the premises until the court determined the validity of the handwritten will. Nora read it on the cottage step while the mail truck backed carefully down the drive. Inside, the greenhouse ticked and settled in the weak sun. A bead of condensation slid down the inside of a pane and stopped where a crack interrupted it. Nora folded the letter and put it with the access papers. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. Maybe there was only so much a day could take before the body began storing fear for later. She went back to the library in town to use the computer because the cottage had no signal and her phone battery was under 20%. The county extension office number was printed on a flyer taped beside the library printer. Soil testing, small farms, pest control, home horticulture. She wrote a message on their online form and deleted the first version because it sounded too close to begging. Inherited abandoned greenhouse. Need safety guidance before entering further. Broken glazing, rusted iron ribs, frozen irrigation, possible old passive heat system. Limited funds. Can send photos if needed. The reply came faster than she expected. Mateo Ruiz called at 3:40, his voice low and practical. He asked 3 questions before offering any opinion: whether any panes were hanging overhead, whether the floor had open voids, and whether she smelled gas or oil. When she said no to the last one, he exhaled softly. "I can stop by tomorrow morning," he said. "County extension, not code enforcement. I'm not there to take it away from you." Nora looked at the library window where her reflection hovered over the darkening street. "I didn't say you were." "No," he said, "but people usually wonder." She almost hung up then, not because he was wrong, but because he had noticed too much. Instead, she gave him the directions from the probate notice and said she would meet him at the gate. Mateo arrived the next morning in a mud-splashed county pickup with a plastic clipboard, a thermos, and a wool cap pulled low over black hair threaded with gray at the temples. He did not offer his hand until Nora offered hers first. He did not ask where she had slept. He stood beside her at the greenhouse entrance and studied the structure before stepping inside. "What do you see?" he asked. Nora glanced at him, guarded. "You're the specialist. And you worked in a nursery. Start there." That small correction changed the air between them. She looked up. "West roof has the worst slippage. Those clips are failing where the rust lifted the paint. The panes over the center aisle are the ones I don't trust. Irrigation froze along the north wall. Stone floor cracked near the second bench, but I don't know if it's settlement or something underneath." Mateo nodded once as if she had handed him useful measurements. "Good. We stay out from under the loose glass. We don't force any valves. We don't move anything heavy until we know what the floor is doing." They worked without touching much at first. Mateo used the end of a folding ruler to point out stress marks in the iron ribs, places where rust had swollen around bolt heads, and glazing clips that could be replaced cheaply if the frame beneath them still held. Nora wrote costs in the margin of the certified letter because it was the only paper she had. Gloves, tape, plywood clips, contractor bags, battery lantern. Don't spend on pretty, Mateo said. Spend on dry and safe. I wasn't planning pretty. I know. People sometimes do when they're scared. Nora lowered the pencil. I'm not asking you to fix this. I didn't think you were. His kindness had no softness in it. That made it easier to accept. By mid-morning, they reached the fixed propagation bench. Up close, it looked heavier than the others, built of cedar planks over a deep frame with its legs disappearing into the stone rather than resting on top of it. The benches along the opposite wall shifted slightly when Nora pressed them with her knee. This one did not move. 4 dark bolt heads sat near the corners, old and flat, almost hidden under mineral stains. Mateo crouched but kept his hands back. That bench was meant to stay. June used it for starts, Nora said. At least when I was here. For heat, maybe. Propagation benches sometimes had warm runs under them. Old greenhouses used all kinds of passive tricks before electric mats were cheap. There's no working heat. No modern heat, he said. Nora went still. The frostless line had returned. It ran beneath the front edge of the bench, narrower, now that the day was warming, but still too clean to ignore. Nora pulled a torn strip from a paper towel in her pocket. She held it near the stone floor where the white frost ended. Nothing happened at first. Then the paper lifted. Not much. Only a tremble. A small, repeated shiver at the lower edge, as if something below the stone had taken a careful breath. Around them, the rest of the greenhouse remained winter still. Condensation clung to the glass. Ice held inside the irrigation lines. Their own breath showed pale and brief in the air. Mateo did not speak. Nora moved the strip 2 inches to the left. It stopped. She moved it back above the narrow seam where the frost had melted. The paper trembled again. She looked along the floor and saw what she had missed the first morning, a rectangle in the stone, not a loose slab exactly, but a fitted outline half filled with dust and mineral scale. It sat beneath the fixed bench just beyond easy reach. Along one short edge was a thin dark break no wider than a seed label. Nora stayed on her knees, one hand braced against the cold stone, the other holding the paper above the seam. She did not feel rescued. She did not feel safe. But for the first time since the nursery gates had closed, the next thing to do was exact. A strip of tissue paper trembled above the sealed vent while the rest of the greenhouse stayed frozen. Nora stayed on her knees beside the fixed propagation bench, holding the strip of tissue paper above the seam until her fingers began to ache from the cold. The paper trembled, settled, then trembled again. It was not wind from the broken panes. The draft rose too straight, too narrow from one place beneath the cedar frame. Mateo crouched on the opposite side of the bench and rested his forearm on his knee, careful not to touch the stone. Let's prove what it isn't before we decide what it is. Nora nodded. That suited her. Guessing had never kept a tray alive. She tore 2 more strips from the paper towel and placed them along the floor, one near the north wall where the black irrigation line had split, one beside the central aisle crack. Neither moved. When she laid the 3rd strip back over the dark seam under the bench, its edge lifted as if breathed on from below. She watched it for a full count of 10, then shifted it half an inch. The movement weakened. Another half inch, and it stopped. Very narrow source, Mateo said. Like a vent, maybe. Or a joint over an old heat run. He took a small flashlight from his coat pocket and angled the beam low across the floor. The light caught what Nora had missed in the flat, gray morning, not only one rectangular outline, but 2 faint parallel lines running away from it beneath the bench, half buried by dust and mineral scale. Old work left traces when the person who made it expected someone patient to notice. Nora brushed the stone with the tips of her gloves. Fine grit moved, the outline sharpened. The rectangle sat just under the front edge of the fixed bench, too far back to open comfortably unless someone knelt close. Its border was not cut like a modern utility plate. The edges were hand-dressed, slightly uneven, fitted into the larger stone floor with a care that made the rest of the cracked aisle look careless by comparison. Along the short side nearest Nora was a rust-dark frame no wider than a pencil. Mateo swept the light under the cedar bench. Before we move anything, check the heat source. There isn't one. Then we confirm there isn't one. They began at the cottage wall. Nora followed the black irrigation lines with her eyes and hands, tracing each frozen pipe to its valve. The old brass handles had green corrosion around the stems. She did not force them. Mateo checked behind the potting shelves and under the sink in the cottage for any heater pilot flame electrical mat or hidden extension cord. There was no smell of oil, no hum from a pump, no warmth from the cottage wall. The breaker box in the pantry still had cotton-covered labels, and every switch sat dead under a film of dust. Back in the greenhouse, Mateo pointed toward the base of the north wall. "See those low openings?" Nora crouched. A row of small brick-faced holes ran along the wall behind a stack of empty flats, each one the size of a hand, each plugged with old clay and dirt. She had thought they were drains. Heat channels, she asked. Could be. Some older glasshouses moved warm air under benches through clay flues or stone runs. Not fancy, just practical. A little stored heat where young roots needed it. But nothing's feeding it. No active system, he said. That doesn't mean the space below can't hold a different temperature. Dry air moves strangely under stone. Nora returned to the fixed bench. The warm line waited there, quiet and exact. She went to June's tool board and took down the soil knife, the small pry bar labeled lifting, and a flat screwdriver with a taped handle. She paused at the labels. June's handwriting made even tools seem entrusted rather than stored. Mateo noticed. "We can stop here." "No." The word came out too sharp, so Nora softened her grip on the pry bar. "I mean, I don't want to force it, but I need to know whether it's dangerous." That's a good enough reason. He laid his clipboard on the nearest movable bench and sketched the rectangle before they disturbed it. Date, location, dimensions, condition. Nora measured with his folding ruler 22 inches by 14 set 4 inches back from the bench's front rail. The bench legs did not rest on the stone like the others. They disappeared into fitted holes pinned below the floor or built around something deeper. 4 flat bolt heads held the cedar frame down, old and mineral-stained, but the wood around them was solid. Nora slid the screwdriver into the nearest floor seam. It did not enter. She tried the soil knife and found one place where the point slipped into packed grit. She worked slowly, scraping a 1/4 inch at a time, pulling out dust, white scale, and a few dead beetle shells. Mateo held the flashlight steady without reaching in. The greenhouse made small winter sounds above them, a pane ticking in the frame. A drop falling from a rusted rib, wind crossing the broken roof vent. "Don't pry against the stone yet," he said. "I'm not. I know. I'm saying it because I would be tempted." That almost made her smile. The seam cleared along the near edge first. Beneath the grit, the dark line proved to be metal, a narrow iron lipset flush with the floor. Nora rubbed it with the glove's thumb until a tiny round hollow appeared near the right corner. Not a screw head, not a nail. A finger pull filled with years of dirt. She sat back on her heels. Mateo leaned lower. Someone meant that to open. Nora looked at the fixed bench, the old cedar dark from decades of mist, the labels on June's tools, the breath of warm air moving through a place no one had touched. For a moment, she was 16 again, standing beside June while winter rain tapped the glass overhead, trying not to look grateful for the single afternoon when no one expected her to explain herself. Some roots wait in the dark without dying. She said it under her breath, not for Mateo. The words settled into the greenhouse without echo. Then she went back to work. It took nearly an hour to clear enough of the iron lip to move it. Nora used the taped screwdriver for scale the soil, knife for packed grit, and the corner of a broken plant label to clean the small pull without scratching it wider. Her knees went numb against the stone. Twice she had to stop and warm her fingers inside her sleeves. Mateo went to his truck and returned with thin work gloves, a dust mask, and a battery lantern, placing them on the bench without ceremony. "Borrowed," he said. Nora put on the gloves. "I'll bring them back." That was the idea. When the pull finally showed clean, Mateo had her pause. He took photos from 3 angles, then asked her to press gently rather than lift. The metal did not move. She tried again with both thumbs. Nothing. Only when she slid the soil knife along the far seam did the plate give a dry, small click. The sound went through Nora's shoulders. Mateo raised one hand. Stop there. They waited. No shift in the bench. No dropping stone. No pane falling overhead. Just the narrow draft, a little stronger now, carrying a smell unlike the rest of the greenhouse. Dry clay, old paper, a trace of cedar. Nora hooked 2 fingers into the pull and lifted. The plate rose less than an inch before it caught. She lowered it, cleared more grit along the right edge, and tried again. This time, the iron lip came up slowly, dragging a line of dust with it. Beneath was not an open hole, but a second layer. A clay-lined channel, dark and dry, running under the bench like a shallow throat. Warm air moved through it with enough steadiness to lift dust motes in the lantern beam. The chamber was not large at the opening. It widened farther back. Nora lay on her side to see beneath the bench. Her shoulder pressed against cold stone. The flashlight showed clay pipe segments fitted end to end, their joints sealed once with lime mortar that had cracked but not failed completely. Beyond them, the channel opened into a dry stone pocket beneath the center of the bench. It was larger than a vent needed to be. Someone had built it with a flat-top stone and side walls, then hidden the access under the iron plate. At the front edge of the pocket, something brass caught the light. Nora stopped breathing for 1 second, then made herself start again. "Do you see it?" Mateo asked. "Yes." "Can you reach without scraping the sides?" "Maybe." "Use the long tweezers from the toolboard if she has them." June did. They hung below the snips labeled transplanting tweezers in the same square hand. Nora brought them back and lowered herself again, working the tool through the narrow opening. The first object resisted not because it was stuck, but because she was shaking enough to miss it twice. On the third try, the tweezers closed on a thin brass tag. She drew it out slowly. It was a plant marker, tarnished dark at the edges with one hole punched through the top where wire had once held it to a tray. Nora wiped it with her sleeve. The stamped letters emerged shallow but readable. Avery, line, keep dry. No date, no variety, only that instruction. Mateo sat back on his heels and looked away from it almost immediately, giving her room to understand before anyone spoke over the moment. Nora set the brass tag on the bench, then reached into the chamber again. Behind where the tag had lain, the flashlight showed the pale edge of an envelope. Not white anymore. Cream, darkened by age, sealed with a line of waxed paper folded over itself. The envelope had been placed inside a small cedar sleeve, high enough above the clay bottom that any old damp would have passed beneath it. Careful, deliberate. She could not reach it with the tweezers. Mateo studied the opening. "We can widen the plate another inch if the hinge isn't frozen." "I don't want to break it." "Then don't pull upward. Ease it towards you first." Nora did as he said, palms flat on the iron lip. The plate shifted forward with a low scrape, opening just enough for her hand. Warm air rose over her wrist. She reached into the pocket, felt cedar paper, and the small resistance of something that had waited a long time to be touched. The envelope came free without tearing. June's handwriting was on the front. Nora knew it before she could read the words. The careful pressure of each letter, the plane spacing the way the capital N leaned slightly left as if bracing itself. Her own name was written there not as a surprise, not as a flourish, but as a practical fact. For Nora Elise Caldwell. She sat back on the cold floor with the sealed envelope in both hands. Mateo stood quietly and took 2 steps toward the aisle, turning his attention to the broken roof glass as if that had become suddenly important. He did not ask to see it. He did not ask what it said. In that silence, Nora understood he had chosen not to take the moment from her. The opening beneath the bench breathed softly. The chamber beyond the plate held more shadow than the flashlight could read, and the dry stone pocket widened farther back than a simple heat run required. Nora could see the corner of something wooden beyond the first chamber wall, but she did not reach for it. Not yet. The greenhouse had given her one thing, and one thing was enough to hold carefully. She looked at the envelope, then at the brass tag resting on the cedar bench. Avery, line, keep dry. Outside, winter daylight passed through cracked glass and broke across the stone in pale shapes. The rest of the greenhouse remained cold. Only the old channel under June's fixed bench gave off its narrow, patient warmth. Nora held the sealed seed envelope in cold daylight while warm air touched her hands. Nora opened June's sealed letter at the cottage table with seed trays stacked beside her and a chipped mug holding water she had boiled twice for safety. She had waited until Mateo drove back to town for photocopy sleeves and a better flashlight. Waiting had felt impossible inside the greenhouse with warm air moving over her hands and the chamber breathing under the bench, but the envelope was too cleanly kept to tear open on the stone floor. She set it on the table as if it were a living cutting that might bruise. The cottage window gave poor light, so she pulled the chair closer to the sink where winter sun slipped through the cracked pane and fell across June's handwriting. For Nora Elise Caldwell. No decoration, no apology. The letters were pressed firmly into the paper, the ink darker where June's hand had paused. Nora slid the soil knife under the folded waxed paper seal and lifted with the care June had once taught her to use on seedlings too tender for fingers. The envelope opened with a dry whisper. Inside were 4 folded pages, a smaller paper packet, and a brass tag rubbed bright along one edge from being handled often. The first page began without greeting. If this has reached you, Nora, then the bench did what it was made to do. It kept something dry, and it made you wonder. That is a useful beginning for a greenhouse keeper. Curiosity is safer than panic. It makes a person look twice before pulling, cutting, selling, or giving up. The chamber, under the propagation bench, is older than I am. My grandmother called it the warm run. Her mother helped lay the first clay pipe when the original nursery was still half kitchen garden and half teaching room. They built it to hold heat where small roots needed mercy in late winter. Later, when the oil stove failed and money was poor, the bench still kept a few trays alive because stone remembers warmth longer than glass does. Do not trust every envelope you find down there. Some are seeds. Some are records. Some are both in their way. The brass tags marked Avery Line belong to the dry archive. Keep those packets sealed until you can make a list with clean hands, dry paper, and a pencil that will not run. If a packet is dated before 1980, do not plant it all. Test 10 seeds at most between damp paper in a covered dish. Label variety, date, source, and result. A seed without a name is not free. It is lost. Nora stopped there and pressed her thumb against the table edge. She could hear June in the sentence not as a memory softened by grief, but as the exact woman who had once made her rewrite 8 tomato labels because she had used a pen that bled when misted. A seed without a name is not free, it is lost. The second page had a faint brown crescent where a mug had once rested on it. I left the greenhouse to you because you learned how to be careful before you learned how to be confident. That is rarer than confidence. You were 16 when you first came here. You stood by the east bench with your hands in your sleeves and looked at every door before you looked at me. I knew that habit. I had seen it in other girls who were told a room was temporary until they believed every room was temporary. For 31 years, this greenhouse sold start seed cuttings and repair work. That is what the tax forms say, and it is true enough for people who only need one truth. But the greenhouse also paid for bus passes, exam fees, work boots, nursing uniforms, haircuts before interviews, and quiet envelopes left with women who did not want charity named in public. Some were foster girls, some were young mothers, some were widows who had never asked for anything until they had to. Do not make saints of us. We sold plants, we kept accounts. We argued with weather and aphids and bad glass. We charged customers who could pay, and we used some of that money to help people cross a narrow place without losing their dignity. The records are in the cedar box behind the seed drawers. They are not a treasure. They are proof of intent. Nora looked toward the cold fireplace, then back at the envelope. The word intent sat on the page like a tool laid down for later use. She turned the third page. If anyone tells you I did not know what I was signing, show them the ledger dates, the seed index, and the yellow notebook marked Spring Holdover. My hand shook at the end. My mind did not. You will find letters from some of the girls and women I helped. You do not owe them your eyes all at once. Read slowly. Stop when the room gets too crowded. You will also find scholarship receipts, not all formal and not all impressive. a community college fee, a license renewal, a bus ticket to Medford, 2 weeks of childcare paid under the name of a plant order because the woman taking the money needed not to be seen taking it. If the court wants numbers, give numbers. If it wants dates, give dates. Do not give them anyone's shame. If you choose not to keep this place, I will not rise from the dirt to scold you. A building can become too heavy for one pair of hands. But before you let it go, look under the bench, read the records, and understand what you are selling. There were 2 lines left. Grow what the world forgot to protect. June Avery. Nora did not cry while she read it. Her body did something quieter. It let go of a breath she had been holding since the nursery gate closed, and with it went a small, hard certainty that every kindness eventually became a bill. Outside, a truck door shut. Mateo knocked once before opening the cottage door, holding a cardboard folder under one arm and a pack of clear sleeves in the other. He saw the unfolded pages on the table and stopped just inside. "You want me outside?" he asked. Nora shook her head, then changed it to words. "No. I need to find a cedar box." They returned to the greenhouse together, not speaking much. The chamber, under the fixed bench, still breathed through the opening they had left covered with a clean board and 2 bricks. Nora did not reach deeper into it yet. June's letter had pointed elsewhere, first to the seed drawers. The seed room was a narrow space off the potting area, more cabinet than room, with shelves from floor to ceiling and a small, high window filmed with condensation. Nora found the drawers by touch before she could read the labels. Beans, tomatoes, lettuce, herbs, flowers for cutting. Below them, behind a warped sliding panel, sat a cedar box with tarnished hinges and a strip of masking tape across the lid. Spring holdover. Mateo set the lantern on the floor and stepped back. Again, that careful distance. Inside were notebooks, receipts, envelopes, and letters bundled with cotton twine. The top notebook was dated in June's hand from only 7 months earlier. Nora opened to the middle and saw rows of entries written with slow but steady pressure. Tomato starts a Saturday market $82. Glass repair fund $25. M. Bus pass $18. Child care 2 afternoons $40. Seed order held back until March. The numbers were small. That made them feel larger. Beneath the notebook were letters from women Nora did not know. She read only the first lines of 3 because June had told her not to let the room get too crowded. "Miss Avery, I passed the exam. June, the boots fit. I got the apartment. I wrote my own name on the lease." Nora folded each one back along its crease. The paper had been handled but not displayed. Kept, not shown off. She understood the difference. Mateo took photographs only when she asked. He placed each document in a sleeve, wrote its position on a blank sheet, and let Nora decide what belonged in the first folder. When she grew still over a receipt, he did not prompt her. When her hands shook, he slid the lantern closer so the light improved and pretended that was all he had noticed. "This helps the will?" Nora asked. "It helps show pattern, dates, capacity, intent," he said. "But Mrs. Larkin should tell you what the court needs. I'm plants and structure, not law. I don't have a lawyer." "I know." She looked at him then. He lifted one shoulder. "There are legal aid clinics. The clerk may know which forms matter. One thing at a time. One thing at a time." In the greenhouse, that was not a comfort phrase. It was a method. Seed label water. Glass frame floor. Letter ledger proof. What small kindness would you have kept private if keeping it private was the only way someone could accept it? By late afternoon, the cottage table had become a sorting surface. June's letter lay in the center. To the left, Nora placed seed indexes and dated greenhouse notes. To the right, receipts that showed money leaving the plant business for bus passes, fees, boots, and classes. The personal letters went back into the cedar box after each was counted, not read. Nora wrote "private" on a slip of paper and laid it over them. A white van slowed on the road beyond the gate just before sunset. It bore the logo of a storage company from Grants Pass. The driver did not get out. He looked at the greenhouse, made a note on his phone, and drove on. Nora watched from the cottage window until the van disappeared between firs. The greenhouse could become storage. The thought arrived flat and practical, which made it more frightening than anger. Its glass could be stripped. The benches could be broken out. The seed drawers could go to a salvage shop, the iron ribs to scrap the cottage to a caretaker who did not know June's labels from trash. Nora returned to the table and put both hands on the letter. She was not ready to promise she could save the place. Promises made from fear were too easy to break. But she could promise the next act. She could keep the records dry. She could call Mrs. Larkin in the morning. She could ask about legal aid. She could cover the open vent, lock the cottage door as well as it would lock, and not let anyone remove a single drawer until the court had heard what June had left in ink. She smoothed the first page with the side of her hand. The paper resisted, then lay flat. Beside it, in a shallow tray, 10 old seeds from an undated packet sat untouched, waiting for clean paper, water, and a name. Nora pressed June's letter flat beside a tray of dormant seeds. By morning, the rain had turned to a thin frost that silvered the blackberry canes along the gate. Nora woke in the cottage chair with June's letter folded inside a clear sleeve and the cedar box pushed against the inside wall where no draft could reach it. Her neck ached. Her boots were still on. Before she boiled water, before she counted the money left in her envelope, she walked into the greenhouse with the push broom, a cracked plastic tub, and the roll of orange tape. The first work was not noble. It was sharp. Broken glass lay in the beds under the benches and along the center aisle where wind had carried it farther than seemed possible. Nora started beneath the safest section of roof sweeping with short strokes so she would not throw shards against the iron legs. When the tub grew heavy, she carried it outside and emptied it into an old metal barrel she had dragged from behind the potting shed. The glass rang against itself bright and cold. After the third load, she cut her glove on a crescent-shaped piece hidden beneath frozen soil. The shard did not reach skin, but it left a clean slit across the palm. She stood there staring at it, angry, out of proportion to the damage, then changed gloves and wrote, "Gloves real leather" on the cost list. Mateo came after 10 with 2 sheets of half-inch plywood strapped in his truck bed and a bundle of lath he said had been sitting in his garage too long. Nora reached for her wallet before he had even lowered the tailgate. "Not a gift," he said. "Scrap. Use it or I take it back to the same corner. I can pay something. You can buy screws." That she could accept. They boarded the worst openings first, not the most visible ones. Mateo made her choose. The missing west panes over the main aisle mattered more than the cracked glass near the potting shelf. The low north wall mattered because rain ran through it toward the seed room. Pretty could wait. Dry and safe could not. Nora measured, marked, and held the plywood while Mateo cut. She learned quickly that old greenhouse frames were not square just because they looked orderly from a distance. Every opening had its own bad opinion. One board needed shaving at the corner. Another required a shim where rust had lifted the iron bar away from its old line. They used exterior screws washers wide enough not to tear through softened wood and lath strips to spread pressure where the frame still had grip. By late afternoon, blue painter's tape marked every salvageable pane. Orange tape marked danger. Bare plywood covered the worst holes like temporary bandages. The greenhouse looked patched, not healed, but the wind no longer moved freely through the west wall. Nora stood in the center aisle and listened. The place still clicked and dripped. It still smelled of cold iron and old soil. But the sound had changed. Less of the weather was inside. The next day, Mateo brought 2 adjustable braces, a box of rust-stained clamps, and a rule Nora had not asked for, but needed no one worked under loose glass when the wind moved the fir tops. They began at the iron ribs nearest the fixed propagation bench. Rust had swollen around several bolt heads, flaking the old paint into brown scales. Mateo showed her how to brush loose rust without polishing away sound metal, how to look for splitting at the joint plates, and how to tap with the handle of a screwdriver, listening for a dead note instead of a clean ring. "Frame first," he said. "If the frame shifts, the glass does whatever gravity tells it." Nora held the brace while he set its foot on a scrap of plywood to spread the load over the stone floor. The first time she tightened the screw jack, she turned too far, and a pane above them gave a small warning tick. She froze. Mateo put one hand up, calm but immediate. "Back it off a quarter turn." She did. The pane settled, nothing fell. Her face burned under the cold. "I should have known." "You learned before it broke. That counts. They worked more slowly after that. Brace check, clamp check, mark the joint, photograph the condition. Nora wrote everything in June's yellow notebook because the court might need dates and because work became more real when it left a mark. At noon, they tested which benches could move. The loose cedar benches along the east wall shifted when pushed from the base. 2 had to be cleared of old trays before they could slide. 1 had a cracked leg and was left alone. The propagation bench did not yield. Nora cleaned around its legs with a narrow brush. The cedar supports disappeared into fitted holes in the stone, and the 4 dark bolt heads held the frame as if the greenhouse had been built around it. Mateo tried no tool on them. He only knelt, looked, and said, "That one stays until we understand the heat run. I wasn't going to move it." "I know." She heard in his voice that he did know, and the defensiveness went out of her shoulders. That afternoon, he asked her to walk the greenhouse and tell him the order of repair without looking at her notes. She started with the broken panes, then corrected herself. "No. Stabilize the frame enough that the panes can be handled. Board the open weather side. Keep the seed room dry, then vent cover, then irrigation later after the freeze." Mateo nodded. Good. It was a small word, but it landed somewhere tired in her. For years, adults had praised Nora for being quiet when they meant convenient independent, when they meant unattended grateful, when they meant cheap to keep. This was different. This was a man looking at a rusted greenhouse and saying her order of work made sense. She did not thank him too warmly. She marked 3 more panes with blue tape and kept working. The second certified letter arrived while Nora was scraping mineral scale from the seed room threshold. Mrs. Larkin had called first, her voice clipped but careful. A new filing came in. "You should pick up a copy. Also, there's a legal aid clinic in Grants Pass on Thursdays. I cannot advise you, but I can give you the address." Nora pressed the phone between shoulder and ear and wrote on the back of a seed catalog. "Does the filing stop me from repairs?" "Necessary preservation is different from removal or alteration," Mrs. Larkin said. "Document everything. Do not discard records. Do not sell contents. Photograph before and after. Then I keep rain off the glass house." A pause. "I would." That was as much permission as the clerk could give. The filing was worse in tone than in substance. June's cousin claimed undue influence confusion and improper transfer of an asset whose value Nora had neither earned nor understood. Nora read that sentence twice in the library parking lot, then folded the paper and put it in the folder with June's letter. She did not write an angry statement. She wanted to. Instead, she built a timeline. June's dated notebook entries went first. Then seed orders. Then receipts. Then the card Nora had received in autumn with the pressed tomato leaf still inside. She did not include the private letters from women June had helped not yet. Those were people, not ammunition. She listed them as sealed correspondence stored in cedar box available if court requests with privacy protection. At the greenhouse, Mateo found her sitting at the cottage table surrounded by paper. "You eat today?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at the untouched cracker packet by her elbow. "Eventually," she said. He set down a photocopy sleeve and a small digital thermometer. "For the seed room. Not for you." That almost made her laugh, and the almost was enough. Together they made a preservation log. Date, task, reason, materials, cost, photograph number. Nora wrote plainly boarded west roof gap to prevent water damage to greenhouse records and seed archive. Swept glass from main aisle to reduce injury risk. Braced iron rib, 3 to prevent additional glazing collapse. Covered heat channel opening temporarily. No contents removed except brass tag and envelope documented in photos. The discipline steadied her. Facts did not make the cousin kinder. They made his claims less foggy. Near sunset, she walked to the greenhouse alone and stood beside the fixed bench. The open vent was still covered with the board and bricks. Warmth slipped around the edges barely enough to move dust. Somewhere below, the chamber held what June had protected, and above it, the taped panes caught the last daylight in blue marks. Nora put one hand on the bench. "I'm not making a speech for you," she said quietly. The greenhouse answered with a drip from the roof. "That's probably better," she added. They waited for a dry morning to work on the heat channel. Mateo was firm about that. Moist air, open chamber old paper, and cold stone made a poor combination. When the weather finally cleared, the sky was pale and hard, and the greenhouse roof flashed with thin ice where the remaining panes held sunlight. Nora set the cedar box in the cottage, closed the door, and laid out the tools in order: brush, flashlight, screwdriver. Narrow vacuum nozzle borrowed from the library's maintenance closet with permission lime mortar patch in a small tub, cedar strips, brass screws, and a sheet of clear polycarbonate cut to fit over the access. The goal was not to seal the secret away again. It was to protect it without lying about it. Mateo called the cover reversible. Nora liked the word. It meant the next careful person would not have to break what they did not understand. They lifted the iron plate fully for the first time. Its underside was rusted, but intact with 2 old hinge pins set into the stone. Nora photographed the hinges, the clay pipe segments, the cracked lime joints, and the dry pocket beyond. She removed only loose grit from the front channel using the brush. First, then the vacuum at its weakest setting with a piece of mesh taped over the nozzle so nothing small could vanish by accident. Warm air rose steadily against her wrists. The clay pipes were not whole, but they had not collapsed. 3 segments ran beneath the bench, their curved tops darkened by age. The mortar between 2 joints had cracked into a narrow V. Mateo mixed a small amount of lime-based patch, not modern hard cement, and showed Nora how to press it into the joint without smearing it across the old clay. Soft repair for old material, he said. Let the old work keep being old. Her first patch was too thick. He had her scrape half away and feather the edge with a damp brush. The corrected seam looked humbler and better. It did not pretend to be new. Behind the clay run the dry chamber widened into shadow. Nora could see more cedar sleeves stacked beyond reach, but she obeyed June's order and touched none of them. Clean hands, dry paper, pencil, a list first. Not today. She set the brass tag and the sealed envelope, now sleeved, on the bench long enough to photograph them with the repaired opening. Then she returned them to the cottage table. The chamber itself received a temporary guard, cedar strips resting on existing stone edges, the clear polycarbonate panel above them, and 4 brass screws set into the strips instead of the historic floor. A small gap at the back allowed the warm draft to keep moving. Nothing was glued. Nothing was hidden. When the cover was in place, Nora laid her palm above it. The warmth still rose thinner now, but present. Mateo packed his tools without speaking. Outside, the afternoon light had softened, and the plywood patches on the west wall held against a low wind. The greenhouse remained damaged in 100 ways. It still needed glass, water, time, money, and a court willing to read what June had written. But the worst openings were boarded. The frame nearest the bench was braced. The records were sleeved and logged. The heat channel had been cleared, its cracked clay patched, and the hidden chamber protected by a cover that could be removed by any future hand patient enough to look. Nora stood in the main aisle as cold daylight turned soft across the taped panes, listening to warm air move beneath June's fixed bench. By the first week of February, the irrigation lines began to thaw in short, stubborn pieces. Nora learned this by mistake when a black tube along the north wall softened under her hand and released a thin ribbon of brown water across her boot. She shut the valve before the ribbon became a leak. For 3 days she worked only where the temperature allowed it. Mateo had left her the small digital thermometer, and she checked it before touching any line. Greenhouse, air pipe, surface, cottage, sink, seed room. If the plastic was too cold, she waited. Waiting had begun to feel less like defeat and more like part of the repair. The mineral buildup inside the first valve looked like pale stone. Nora soaked the removable fittings in vinegar jars on the cottage table, labeling each one with masking tape so she would know which line it belonged to. The old washers cracked when she lifted them, so she spent $6 at the hardware store on replacements and wrote the amount in the preservation log. When the first narrow water line finally ran clear into a bucket, she did not celebrate. She let it run for 10 seconds, closed the valve, checked the joint for seepage, and wrote, "North bench line restarted, low pressure only." Then she stood very still and listened to water move through a greenhouse that had been silent for years. The first memory arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Mrs. Larkin called before Nora opened it. A woman asked whether mail could be forwarded to you at the property. I told her I could not provide your address without permission. Who was she? She said June once bought her work boots. Nora gave permission. After that, the letters came in 2s and 3s. Not many. Enough. One woman sent a receipt from a community college welding class with June's greenhouse name written in the memo line. Another sent a copy of an old bus pass tucked behind a note that said, "Only." She told me to pay it forward quietly, so I did. A third wrote that June had watched her daughter for 2 afternoons in the cottage kitchen while she interviewed for a job at a dental office. Nora read each letter once, logged it, and placed it back in the cedar box. She did not let herself turn their lives into proof too quickly. Still proof was what the court required, so she made a second list witness willing to confirm document included privacy concern. Mateo brought a scanner borrowed from the extension office and showed her how to save copies to a thumb drive. He did not read the letters unless she handed them to him. One afternoon, a woman named Dana called from Medford. Her voice was careful, older than Nora expected. June said if anything happened, someone might need dates, Dana said. I kept the check stub. It was for my testing fee. I can send it. You don't have to tell me anything personal, Nora said. I know. That's why I'm telling you. After the call, Nora walked into the greenhouse and put both hands flat on the fixed bench. The cedar was cold on top, warm beneath. June had not saved anyone loudly. The greenhouse had worked like its old heat channel, carrying warmth through hidden places until something fragile could survive. In March, the distant cousin's attorney sent an offer through Mrs. Larkin's office. Nora could withdraw her claim sign over the property and receive a modest settlement from the estate after sale. The number was larger than anything she had held at one time. She read it twice at the cottage table. With that money, she could rent a room for several months. She could buy a used car that started every morning. She could stop sleeping with one ear tuned to the cottage door. The offer did not make her greedy. It made her tired. The same day, a seed collector from Portland left a message about the Avery line packets. He had heard there might be old regional varieties. He used the words rare and valuable with a smoothness that made Nora close the voicemail before it ended. That evening, she took June's brass tag from its sleeve and set it on the fixed bench. Avery line keep dry, not sell fast, not open for spectacle, not turn one woman's quiet work into rent money and a clean escape. The teaching bench needed repair before any seed testing could be done properly. Nora sanded the cedar top by hand not to make it new, but to remove splinters and mineral crust. She tightened the corner blocks with brass screws set into existing holes. She oiled the wood lightly and wiped away more than she left. Mateo helped her mount the old brass tag underneath the bench rail where a student might find it only by kneeling close. Most people would put that where everyone could see it, he said. Nora ran her thumb over the rail. June didn't. They did not discuss the settlement again that day. Nora placed the offer in the legal folder behind the preservation log and before the witness list. It belonged there. It did not belong on the bench. The first trays were not planted for beauty. Nora chose common sturdy seeds, first lettuce, calendula, parsley, and one carefully counted test of an Avery line tomato packet dated 1979. 10 seeds only, as June had instructed. She wrote every label in pencil variety, date, source, tray number, test count. She dampened paper for the tomato test, placed it in a covered dish, and set it near the warm run, not directly over it. The greenhouse was still patched with plywood. Blue tape marked panes waiting for repair. The irrigation ran only along one narrow line, but by late March the air changed for a few hours each afternoon. Condensation gathered on repaired glass instead of blowing away through broken openings. The stone floor lost its hardest cold. The hearing date arrived by mail on a Tuesday. Nora taped the notice above the cottage table and kept working. That was not courage. It was all she knew how to do without coming apart. On the 6th morning, after planting a green hook lifted from the lettuce tray. By noon, 3 more had broken the surface. They were small enough to miss if a person walked quickly past them, but Nora had learned to move slowly in that place. She crouched until her eyes were level with the tray. Mateo found her there when he came in carrying a packet of glazing clips. "Good sign?" he asked. Nora nodded. He looked at the seedlings, then at the patched roof, the braced ribs, the clear cover over the heat channel chamber, and the legal folder lying open on the bench. "The greenhouse still works." Nora wrote those words in the preservation log not because they were legal language, but because they were true. Green shoots lined the tray beneath patched glass while cold daylight turned soft. In late spring, on the morning of the small reopening, Nora wiped condensation from a repaired pane with the cuff of her gray hoodie and watched the glass clear under her hand. The greenhouse did not look finished in the way a store looked finished. Several panes were still salvage pieces that did not match their neighbors. One west wall board remained in place until she could afford proper glazing. Rust stains marked the iron ribs where Mateo had helped her stabilize the frame but not disguise its age. The stone floor kept its cracks. The cottage door still stuck when rain came hard from the south. But the building stood dry enough to work in, warm enough to start seeds, and honest enough to teach from. The probate hearing had taken less time than Nora feared, and more strength than she expected. There was no dramatic speech. Mrs. Larkin sat behind a table with files arranged in careful stacks. The cousin's attorney spoke about value uncertainty and an elderly woman's judgment. Nora's legal aid volunteer answered with dates records, witness statements, and June's own steady handwriting. The yellow notebook mattered. The seed index mattered. The receipts mattered. The witness letters mattered most because they were restrained. None of the women asked for attention. They only confirmed what June had done and when she had done it. Dana from Medford appeared by video sitting in a break room with a vending machine behind her. She held up the old check stub for her testing fee and said, "Miss Avery knew exactly what she was doing. She always did." Nora did not win the greenhouse by being more wounded than anyone else. She kept it because June's records proved intention, pattern, memory, and care. The handwritten will stood. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Mateo asked if she wanted coffee. Nora looked at the folder in her arms, then at the gray sky over Grant's Pass. "I want to go check the vents." He smiled a little. "That sounds right." Now the old propagation bench sat at the center of the greenhouse, cleaned and repaired, but not polished beyond recognition. Underneath its rail, June's brass tag was mounted where the hand naturally found it while kneeling. The clear cover over the heat channel chamber remained removable, secured with brass screws and cedar strips, and the warm run continued to breathe through the narrow back gap. Beside it, seed drawers had been cataloged in pencil and scanned in duplicate. The Avery line packets were not sold. Nora had received 3 more offers after the hearing, one from the seed collector, one from a boutique farm, and one from a man who spoke of branding before he spoke of plants. She declined all 3, not angrily. She wrote short letters thanking them for their interest and explaining that the archive would remain under greenhouse care while viability tests were done slowly and documented properly. Money still mattered. It mattered every time she bought screws instead of bread from the nicer bakery, every time she chose 1 sheet of glass instead of 2. But the greenhouse had begun to earn modestly. Tomato starts, calendula plugs, parsley trays, and small repair work for local gardeners brought in enough to buy potting mix labels, vinegar gloves, and the next set of glazing clips. Nora kept a cash box in the cottage kitchen and wrote every sale in a ledger June would have understood. On reopening morning, there was no banner. Mrs. Larkin came first wearing the same narrow black cardigan and brought a packet of forms Nora had not asked for but needed. For non-profit consideration later, she said, "Not advice, just paper." A glass worker named Paul delivered 4 salvage panes wrapped in moving blankets and refused payment until June's old camellia cuttings rooted. 2 neighbors left a sack of potting soil by the gate and drove away before Nora could thank them. Mateo arrived last with a thermos and a tray of starts from the extension office, each one labeled correctly. By 10, 5 people stood inside the greenhouse, which felt like a crowd after months of winter quiet. The teaching nursery began with 1 girl. Her name was Lila. She was 15, narrow-shouldered and watchful, in a way Nora recognized without wanting to name. A caseworker brought her, but did not stay close. Lila kept both hands in the sleeves of her black sweatshirt and looked first at the exits, then at the broken panes, then at Nora. Nora did not ask if she liked plants. She set a shallow tray on the teaching bench, then placed a pencil, a packet of calendula seed, and a stack of wooden labels beside it. "First thing is the label," Nora said. Lila glanced at her. Before the seed. Before the seed. Why? Because hope needs a name and a date or it turns into guessing. The girl considered that. Then she picked up the pencil. Nora showed her how to write the variety, the day, and the tray number. She showed her how to press the mix level without packing it hard, how to make a shallow line with the edge of a plant. Label how to drop seeds with enough space that their first leaves would not crowd each other. Lila's first row went crooked. Nora left it crooked. "Do I cover them now?" Lila asked. "Lightly." The girl pinched soil between two fingers and moved with exaggerated care. Nora watched her shoulders lower by the smallest degree. At the far end of the greenhouse, Mateo adjusted a vent chain. Mrs. Larkin sorted forms at the cottage table. Paul measured a pane, but waited to cut. The whole place worked quietly around the bench, not as a performance, but as a room learning its purpose again. Lila pressed soil over the last seed and looked at the tray as if expecting an answer. Nora knelt beside her and touched the underside of the bench where June's brass tag rested warm against the cedar rail. Some roots wait in the dark without dying. Lila did not reply. She only wrote the date on a second label slower than before. In the weeks that followed, the greenhouse found its rhythm. Nora opened the roof vents on unclear afternoons and closed them before the evening cold settled. She tested old seed in counts of 10. She logged germination honestly, including failures. She taught Lila to mist from the side so water would not crater the soil. She taught another girl to clean mineral buildup from a valve without forcing it. She taught herself to ask for help before a repair became damage. The cedar box stayed in the seed room, no longer hidden, but still protected. Private letters remained private. Copies of receipts and records lived in labeled folders for anyone with proper reason to see them. June's letter stayed in a sleeve near the teaching bench, not framed, not displayed, but available, when Nora needed to remember the difference between keeping and owning. Late one afternoon after the others had gone, Nora carried a tray of young tomato seedlings to the fixed propagation bench. The repaired glass above her held the sun in long, pale panels. Beneath the bench, the old heat channel warmed the stone in a narrow line. She set the tray exactly over the place where frost had once melted in January. The seedlings were still small, each one no taller than her thumb, but their stems leaned toward the light with the steady insistence of living things. Nora adjusted one label, pressed a little soil around a weak plant, and looked down the length of the greenhouse. The boarded west opening waited for its final pane. The irrigation line clicked softly as water settled. The cottage window caught the sun and threw it back in a tired gold square. Nothing extravagant had happened. No one had handed Nora a fortune. No crowd had come to applaud her. The cousin did not return to apologize, and she did not need him to. What remained was harder and better a key that opened a sticking cottage door, a ledger that balanced. If she was careful, a bench that held warmth and a place where a girl could write her first label before putting a seed into soil. Nora placed the last tray beneath the repaired glass and watched winter's old frostless line become a row of living green.